Your teeth are probably scrubbed more times in a week than your medieval ancestors bathed in a lifetime. And yet somehow, they survived. Imagine a world where bathing was a luxury, not a routine, and where washing your hands before dinner could mark you as eccentric or even heretical. Close your eyes for a moment and picture the midday market in a bustling medieval town. The sun beats down on narrow cobblestone streets, slick with rainwater, urine, and who knows what else. Vendors shout over the din of horses' hooves and clattering wooden carts, hawking everything from stale loaves of bread to pungent cheeses aged too long in dank cellars. The air hangs heavy with a swirl of odors: sour whey, rank sweat, the faint tang of unwashed bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder. Somewhere behind you, a woman wrings the hair of her naked child with grim determination, trying to chase away lice with a handful of herbs and cold spring water. And yet, beneath this veneer of chaos and filth, life pulsed vibrantly. Children dart between stalls, their laughter ringing against timbered walls. A pair of lovers steals a kiss behind a market stall, oblivious to the flies buzzing around them. Priests lead a solemn procession down the narrow lane, their white robes trailing in mud and muck, carried forward by centuries of ritual and faith. You've been fed one side of the story, the Dark Ages, a time so filthy and backward that only a mind-numbing slog through plague and pestilence awaited. But that's only half the truth. What if I told you that beneath the grime lay a complex tapestry of everyday ingenuity, unexpected hygiene hacks, and social rituals that shape the modern world? That some of the quirkiest, most ingenious cleanliness rituals of the Middle Ages still echo in our toothpaste commercials and spa treatments today. Over the next few minutes, we'll peel back the layers of dust and dirt to reveal 50 astonishing facts about hygiene, food, and survival in the medieval era. Facts your history teacher never mentioned. From bathhouses powered by gravity to culinary experiments that might make you gag or beg for seconds, we'll explore how people adapted, survived, and even thrived in a world that looks dirty only because we view it through 21st century lenses. So buckle up. The Middle Ages weren't just a horror show of grime and disease. They were a time of vibrant culture and surprising sophistication, if you know where to look. Ready to have everything you thought you knew about medieval life turned upside down? Let's dive in. Imagine waking before dawn to a chill that cuts through your woolen tunic. Your feet, wrapped only in rough leather sandals, or sometimes nothing at all, graze the damp wooden floor of your small chamber. There's no soft carpet underfoot, just the creaking boards, slick with last night's melted snow. As you rise, your skin prickles with gooseflesh, and you curse the common fate of medieval peasants: cold, hunger, and the endless itch of fleas and lice. Bare bones. Hygiene soap, as we know it, did not exist in most villages. Instead, your only soap might be a crude mixture of animal fat and wood ash, an unstable paste that smears across your skin with more grime than it washes away. Picture yourself lathering your arms with this gritty sludge. The coarse ashes tickle like broken glass, and the rancid smell of rendered fat lingers in your hair long after the bath. Bathing itself was a rare treat, often reserved for monasteries and wealthy manor houses. In the cold months, you couldn't risk hypothermia by filling a tub with scalding water. Wood fuel was too precious, but in summer, some villages held communal bath days. Water, drawn from a nearby stream or well, warmed over a crackling fire, filled large wooden barrels. Men and women bathed separately, stripping down to threadbare shifts. The experience was equal parts relief and revulsion. The heat soothed aching muscles, yet you shared the water with dozens of neighbors, each leaving behind a swirl of filth and disease. After bathing, or more likely, a simple rinse, you'd return to your clothes, which you infrequently laundered. Change of garments was a luxury. Few owned more than one or two tunics. Pulses of sweat, smoke from the hearth, spilled ale, and the inevitable filth of the fields plastered layers of dirt to your skin. Itching was constant. Fleas hid in the folds of your garments. Lice burrowed into your hair and beard. You scratched until your fingers bled, but the relief lasted only moments before the next bite. The humble loaf and sour brew. Hunger gnaws at your belly long before the midday meal. Your daily bread is coarse and dark, baked from a blend of barley, rye, and the husks of cracked grains. Each bite feels like chewing on dried mud. The crust is so hard that it occasionally chips a tooth. But you swallow hurriedly, because the slightest hunger pang distracts from your work in the fields or the forge. Clean drinking water is a privilege of the wealthy. In the towns, wells were often contaminated by runoff and latrines built too close to the water table. To avoid dysentery, you learned to drink small beer or small ale, a weak brew usually around 2 to 3% alcohol. It's cloudy with sediment, tasting sour and yeasty, but it's safer than the water. You carry a wooden tankard everywhere, sipping from it between oxen-driven trips to the plow, or lumbering back from the market with a meager haul of turnips and salt. Yet even this precaution fails sometimes. You recall the last spring, when the river overflowed and flooded your village. The murky water swept through the fields, carried carcasses from the butcher's yard, and infiltrated your well. Within days, families fell ill, vomiting, cramping, fever. Those who survived clawed at the earth, desperate for cool soil to lean against, praying to saints and demons alike for relief. You were one of the lucky ones. But the memory of that gut-wrenching illness, cold sweat clammy against hot skin, never leaves you. Detailing the sensory onslaught, every sense is under siege. The constant hum of flies buzzes around your head, drawn to the stench of open drains and refuse heaps piled near the houses. You catch yourself swatting at imaginary insects, even in the stillness of your own mind. When you eat, the spoon, if you're lucky, can be nothing more than a bent piece of metal forged by the village blacksmith. It's often too hot to hold, scalding the roof of your mouth as you bring it to your lips. You wince, but you cannot wait. The lukewarm pottage of oats and turnips cools quickly in the cold stone bowl. The chunks of root are occasionally so hard you bite down and taste metal from broken spoon fragments. Your nose has learned to filter out most of the smell, so much so that when you travel to the Lord's manor and step into a polished great hall, you gasp at how clean it is. No sourness of spilled ale soaking into straw-covered floors. No acrid smoke stinging at your nostrils. No open drains gurgling underfoot. For a fleeting moment, you believe such purity can be part of everyday life, until a careless foot kicks over a chamber pot and the illusion shatters. Adaptation and resilience. Despite the hardships, you adapt. You tie scraps of linen around your hair to keep lice at bay. You gather fresh herbs, rosemary, lavender, sage, to tuck into your shift, fooling the flies for a few hours. In winter, you bathe your face with snow and salt water, the tingling cold clearing your sinuses and reminding you that life persists even in the harshest conditions. You learn to laugh at the chaos. On market day, children chase each other through muddy streets, oblivious to the damp chill. A traveling juggler drops pins into the gutter and scoops them free, polishing them with his tunic before tossing them back into the air. Even the clergy, draped in dyed wool, flinch as they pass necessary buckets of chamber pot refused to the town's designated gong farmer, the unseen laborer who hauls away the week's waste under cover of darkness. This is the physiology of survival in the Middle Ages, a world where every breath carries risk, every sip demands vigilance, and every small pleasure, warm bath, clean bowl of porridge, or a moment of quiet, feels like a defiance of the body's limits. And yet, despite itching, stench, and scarcity, people found ways to endure, to find community in common suffering, and to carve dignity from the very dirt that threatened to consume them. By the time you reached adolescence in a medieval village, the stench of home no longer registered as foul. It simply was. Narrow alleys and open markets reeked of spoiled milk, rotting straw, and human waste, yet you barely noticed. From earliest memory, your mother had waved away complaints about the smell, insisting you get used to it, and so you did. The human nose, you learned, adapts. Within days, the olfactory nerves filter out the constant swirl of odors, leaving only sudden, sharp reminders, like the afternoon rain that washes filth into the gutters, or the whiff of perfumed oils wafting from a passing priest's robe. Those moments felt almost miraculous, as if you'd discovered a hidden world free from the grip of grime. Inside your head, a quiet narrative carried you through each day. You acknowledged the itch of fleas and lice with a resigned shrug. That's just how it is. A sharp sting from scratching a scabbed wound reminded you that pain was routine. When fever struck, hot flushes, and delirium, you neither panicked nor prayed for miracles. You accepted it as part of life's pattern, something to endure until the body found its balance or slowly weakened. Each neighbor you watched succumb to illness or accident became another stanza in the communal song of suffering. Funerals blurred into baptisms, births into deaths. All were woven into the same fabric of existence. Long-term plans were a luxury few could afford. You counted life in seasons: spring sowing, summer's tending, autumn's harvest, winter's rationing. Your focus never strayed beyond the next yield. Make it to planting, you told yourself, and you might see another year. This mantra steeled you against despair. If the river flooded your fields or locusts devoured the crops, you simply braced for lean times and scavenged what you could. Barley husks boiled into thin porridge, horsehair cords patching tattered tunics, ash scattered around the cottage to ward off fleas. Each small act of adaptation felt like a triumph over fate. Watching the Black Death sweep through hamlets taught you that horror could become routine. At first, bodies lay in open fields. Then neighbors wrapped loved ones in coarse linen and buried them in mass graves just beyond the churchyard. You dug graveside, shook hands with survivors who carried the look of the near dead, and heard priests recite Latin prayers through trembling lips. Even this brutality etched itself into your psyche as something to accept, not to glorify, but to endure without collapsing into madness. Still, acts of unexpected kindness pierced the bleakness. Bread, left anonymously at a door, whispered blessings for the sick, reminding you that compassion never fully vanished, even when fear reigned. To fortify your spirit, you developed tiny rituals. A smooth river pebble in your pocket grounded you when the world felt unhinged. A whispered word of gratitude each evening, for a dry roof or a bowl of stew provided a moment of solace. Storytelling became both entertainment and therapy. By candlelight, you and your kin spun tales of heroes who braved famine and plague, weaving lessons of endurance and hope into each yarn. Laughter, often dark and biting, punctured the tension. Jokes about clogged latrines or mischievous rats chasing people down muddy lanes helped you face the daily threat of disease with a wry grin. Over time, your survival-first mindset deepened into a quiet confidence. You gathered wild herbs, not just to stave off fevers, but to experiment, mixing poultices of plantain and yarrow to staunch bleeding, steeping lavender to scent your shift and confuse flies. You reinforced your cottage's foundation with fresh ash, learning that the same ember that burned your hand could also protect your home. I will see another spring because I learn, adapt, and endure. You began to believe, transforming passive acceptance into active defiance of whatever fate might bring. This hard-earned resilience shaped the medieval psyche. Pain was inevitable, death was certain, but neither was wholly overwhelming. Instead, people forged community through shared suffering, swapped practical knowledge like prized currency, and celebrated small victories. A successful harvest, a healthy calf, a day without fever, as proof that life, no matter how fragile, persisted. In the face of constant peril, each mundane morning became a choice to live. Each ritual of gratitude a testament to human tenacity. And so, despite the ever-present stench, itching, and threat of illness, medieval souls carried on, remarkable not for the filth they endured, but for the courage with which they met it. In the medieval world, personal cleanliness was never merely a matter of water and soap. It was an unmistakable badge of your place in the social order. In the village, you awoke each morning to the same scraped-together garments you'd slept in, rinsed only if rainwater puddled near your doorstep. Your body bore the muted scent of smoke from the hearth and the tang of last week's salted pork. Fleas and lice embedded themselves into your scalp and tunic without apology. Yet just beyond the common cottages, cut along the same winding lane, stood the monastery, its cloistered walls sheltering a community whose reputation for hygiene was both practical and symbolic. Monastic life revolved around ritual purification. Before dawn's first bell, you watched the monks filing into a stone-built lavabo, a long basin with spouts watering running water, an astonishing luxury in an age of open drains. Each monk laved his hands and face in cold spring water, drawn from the abbey's own well, offering silent prayers of absolution even in this simple act. Twice a week, on appointed bath days, the brothers bathed from a shared copper vessel, scented with spruce twigs and pine resin to ward off insects. Their coarse wool habits were regularly stripped and bleached in lye made from wood ash, then dried on racks in the sunlit courtyard, airing out the clinging odors of human toil. For peasants, the idea of such regular cleansing bordered on heresy. Why risk hypothermia for the luxury of warmth? Wood was precious. Fuel was hoarded for cooking and heating the meager gruel that sustained families through frostbitten winters. A peasant's concept of cleanliness extended only as far as sweeping straw from the floor once in a blue moon, or shaking out a ragged shift before church on holy days. That a monk might scrub himself thrice a week and line dry his habit to keep it bright marked him as set apart, holier, calmer, farther from the raw struggle against disease and decay. Food, too, was an unmistakable signal of rank. In the peasant's cottage, The daily fare consisted of a thin pottage, coarsely ground barley or rye, boiled with whatever vegetables mother could retrieve, turnips, leeks, or wild greens. Meat was an occasional indulgence, reserved for a village feast or a successful hunt in autumn. You learned early to savor each morsel. The starchy paste between boiled beans, the sharp saltiness of cheese made from goat's milk, the faint acrid tang of fermented fish carried in barrels from coastal towns. Each bite was tempered by the knowledge that no more would come until the next market day or the next harvest. Contrast this with the abbot's table in the refectory, where plates of spiced meat appeared alongside freshly baked white bread, its flour sifted to remove coarse bran. Fish, freshwater carp, or salted herring featured prominently on fast days, but was also served when the abbey entertained visiting dignitaries. Monks enjoyed a diet richer in legumes, eggs, and dairy. Honey-sweetened mead or watered-down wine accompanied each meal, sustaining them through long hours of prayer and transcription in the scriptorium. The refectory's stone benches echoed with the clink of pewter tankards, a far cry from the wooden bowls and battered jugs of the common folk. Social hierarchy thus found its clearest expression in both hygiene and diet. The closer you were to the abbot's fires or the Lord's hearth, the more likely you were to swim in heat-warmed water and chew tender cuts of meat. Conversely, the farther you lived from centers of power, geographically or economically, the more you subsisted on the scraps and the grit, scraping bone marrow from leftover bones, rinsing moldy bread to salvage its crumbs, and sucking bones clean in an act of silent desperation. Yet one of the most profound influencers of medieval diet, and by extension, social identity, was the Church's strict regimen of fasting. Lent, Advent, Ember Days, and weekly fasts, mandated by canon law, forced warriors and peasants alike to eschew meat, and, on stricter observances, dairy and eggs. For a peasant, this meant scraping together a meal of pottage thickened with ground nuts or boiled pulses, spiced with bitter leeks or wild garlic. In villages where fish was scarce or expensive, fasting turned into a test of endurance. Families huddled around thin broth, praying for the season when they could once again taste cured pork or fresh cheese. Within the monastery, fasting days became opportunities for culinary innovation. Cooks devised recipes for mock meats made from legumes and grains, shaped and roasted to imitate the texture of flesh. If fish was required, carp from the abbey ponds, carefully tended and harvested, graced the plates of the brothers, while poorer fishermen sold their catch to townsfolk. Monks experimented with almond milk as a substitute for dairy, blending nuts, water, and fragrant spices like cinnamon or saffron to create a luxuriously creamy porridge called almond cream, a delicacy reserved for the high feast of Palm Sunday. These fasting rituals reinforced social boundaries. To break a fast was not just a slip of appetite, but a moral transgression. A peasant who secretly smoked a piece of bacon risked censure at the next Sunday sermon. A monk who indulged too frequently in rich fare might face reprimand from the abbot. In this way, food and hygiene interwove with spiritual discipline, creating a layered hierarchy that governed every aspect of daily life. Even so, undercurrents of resistance and adaptation ran through all classes. Peasants learned to barter fresh eggs for a handful of herbs, using the ashes of burned vegetation to improve the rancid flavor of their winter rations. Monks, too, sometimes chafed at dietary restrictions, smuggling cured fish into the choir stalls during long office hours. When famine or plague struck, the lines blurred. The abbot might open the refectory to starving villagers, and peasants were drafted to dig mass graves for the dead, their hands momentarily cleaner than they had been in months. The social dynamics of hygiene and diet in the Middle Ages were never static. They were a living tapestry of power, faith, necessity, and ingenuity, a testament to how people navigated the thin line between survival and dignity. In every boiled pottage and every shared basin of water, you see the imprint of a society that defined itself as much by what it consumed and how it washed as by the wars it fought or the prayers it intoned. And in that realization lies the true richness of medieval life, a reminder that even in the most challenging conditions, humans craft identity and community through the most elemental acts of nourishment and cleanliness. In the medieval mind, the body was both a vessel of divine creation and a treacherous source of sin. From the moment you awoke, you were keenly aware that flesh was weak. The sharp sting of flea bites, the gnawing pain of hunger, the feverish burn of illness, all reminded you that your corporeal self was subject to corruption. Yet the very same flesh carried your soul toward God, if properly guided. This paradox shaped how you thought about cleanliness, purity, and the rituals meant to bridge the gap between the profane body and the sacred spirit. Your village, well-provided water, stained by clay and tinged with the tang of algae, a liquid fit only for cooking pottage or rinsing sooty dishes. But the notion of holy water, water blessed by a priest, offered a spiritual alternative to mundane washing. At the church's threshold, you dipped your fingers into a stone stoop filled with this sanctified water and traced the sign of the cross on your forehead. For an instant, the invisible barrier of grace washed over you. The smudges on your tunic and the grime under your nails mattered less than the purification of your conscience. In that moment, the divine presence filled the same space that mundane soap and water could not reach. Each feast day, the priest solemnly blessed a new font of holy water at the church's altar. Villagers crowded forward, cupping their hands as if the precious drops were liquid gold. They anointed their lips as well, murmuring a prayer against blight, plague, or, most urgently, a spell of infertility that some whispered had cursed the fields. You watched your neighbors press their palms to their faces, then touch the hem of their garments, confident that this sacred ritual offered protection far more potent than any scrub of lye or handful of mountain herbs. More elaborate ceremonies followed in the great monasteries. At Epiphany, monks processed in solemn silence to the abbey spring, bearing gilded chalices. There, the abbot intoned psalms as he dipped the cups into cold, clear water bubbling from rock. "Behold the living water," he declared, and each brother drank deeply, sealing a vow of purity. Some sipped more than courtesy demanded, tasting the chill rush of spring against their throats. It was, they said, the clearest water in Christendom, imbued not only with cleanliness, but with sanctity itself. This spiritual water did not replace all physical washing. No, that was still largely impractical for most, but it offered a solace no bathhouse could. When your body itched from flea bites or stung from chafing clothes, you closed your eyes and remembered the cool touch of holy water on your skin. For a moment, you felt cleansed at a deeper level. Impurities of body and soul cast out by divine grace. The ultimate expression of spiritual hygiene was the ritual of confession and absolution. Kneeling before the priest, you confessed sins, both real and imagined. "I have grumbled against my Lord, eaten meat on a forbidden day, wished ill upon a neighbor. Each uttered fault felt heavier than any stain on your tunic. The priest's words, "I absolve you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit," resounded through your chest like a wave of unguent. In that moment, the burden of guilt lifted, and you believed that your soul was scrubbed clean, regardless of the grime clinging to your fingers. Pilgrimages offered yet another avenue of spiritual cleansing. You joined a ragged group of travelers bound for a distant shrine, each step a penance for past misdeeds. You slept on straw floors, ate coarse bread, and endured rain-soaked roads, all in pursuit of miraculous healing. At the shrine's fountain, pilgrims cupped water rumored to cure gout or blindness. You drank from it, then wrapped your tunic in its flow and tugged it against a festering wound. Whether any physical cure resulted, you felt your spirit purified by the shared faith of thousands chanting hymns in foreign tongues. Even domestic rituals carried sacred weight. Before a meal, your family made the sign of the cross over the bread and ale, a brief plea to sanctify what you were about to consume. If you spilled a drop of ale on the dirt floor, you offered a quick prayer for forgiveness, as if you'd committed a small sacrilege. Such gestures reinforced the conviction that every act, eating, drinking, touching water, was bound up with spiritual significance. Yet the medieval embrace of spiritual hygiene did not entirely replace the desire for physical cleanliness. When a traveling barber surgeon arrived and offered a public bath powered by wood-fired barrels, you queued alongside monks and peasants alike, eager for the rare sensation of hot water running over your skin. Afterwards, you donned a linen shift scented with spice, an unparalleled luxury, and felt for a moment a kind of embodied grace, where spiritual and physical purity converged. In this tapestry of belief and practice, the medieval soul found a way to navigate the tension between flesh and faith. The body was inherently impure, vulnerable to decay and sin. Yet through holy water, confession, pilgrimage, and ritual blessing, the spirit could rise above the flesh's limitations. For a world where soap was precious and clean water dubious, these spiritual rites offered not only comfort, but a profound affirmation that human dignity and divine redemption depended less on the state of the body and more on the condition of the soul. The sun had barely crested the battlements when Aldrich, the castle's freshly appointed cook, flung open the heavy kitchen door and was greeted by the acrid scent of spoiled grain drifting from the storeroom. His heart pounded, not from the morning chill, but from dread. Only days ago, he had arrived here, brimming with ambition and dreams of creating lavish banquets for the Lord's table. Now, he stood at the threshold of calamity. If he served that rancid barley porridge at dawn, his guests would fall ill, and the Lord's wrath was known to be more lethal than any foodborne disease. By the hearth's flickering light, Aldrich scrutinized the sacks lining the storeroom wall. One sack, its coarse linen stained dark around the stitches, spilled tiny mottled kernels onto the flagstone floor. He scooped a handful into his hand. The smell was sour, like vinegar left to ferment under the sun. He tasted a single grain and recoiled as it crunched between his teeth, its rancid bitterness flaming his tongue. If he ground it into flour and served the porridge, half the garrison would be doubling over within hours, and the Lord's steward would demand blood. A clatter of pans and the bawling of kitchen servants reminded him that the morning meal must be ready within the hour. With trembling fingers, he ignited the cauldron's fire and shoved in fresh logs, fighting the urge to flee the castle altogether. If he abandoned his post, the consequences would be worse. Dereliction of duty in the castle kitchens was a crime punishable by humiliation, or worse, the gallows. Yet serving poisoned porridge risked the lives of soldiers and nobles alike, and worse yet, the unforgiving temper of Lord Beaumont. Lord Beaumont was a man of iron will and zero tolerance for failure. Rumor held that a baker who accidentally used too much salt was flayed alive and his children sold into indentured servitude. Aldrich had not yet been introduced to the Lord in person, but he felt that same cold, judging gaze upon the castle's corridors. The slightest culinary misstep here would stain his reputation, and perhaps his flesh, with unstoppable shame. As the fire crackled, Aldrich scanned the kitchen for salvable grain. A sack of oats, its burlap smooth to the touch, sat untouched in a shadowed corner. He pried it open and sniffed. Earthy, slightly sweet, and unmistakably fresh. But oats alone would yield a thin, watery gruel that would offend both palate and pride. He needed barley to thicken the porridge, barley that might be good if he removed every rancid kernel. Sweat beaded on his brow as he dumped the spoiled grains onto a large wooden table. With painstaking care, he sorted kernel by kernel, discarding anything discolored or shriveled. The task took precious minutes, and all the while the kitchen porter tapped his foot and hissed, "Get on with it, cook." Aldrich's hands flew over the grains, his mind split between two gnawing fears: that he'd miss a single spoiled kernel, dooming the breakfast guests, and that the time spent sorting would delay the meal past the Lord's rising. In the distance, bells tolling the hour echoed across the courtyard. Half the kitchen slaves had already fled to serve as scullions in the Lord's private chambers, and the scalding oil for frying fish lay unheated. He scraped the last heap of suspect barley into a waste bucket and rolled the sack away. Then, with a deep, shuddering breath, he dumped fresh oats into the cauldron, added water drawn from the castle's deepest well, and set the porridge over the flames. He ladled in a handful of salted pork fat, enough to add flavor without risking rancidity, and stirred with his iron paddle until the mixture boiled and thickened. The sweet, nutty aroma of cooking oats rose, and for a moment Aldrich dared hope. But hope was a fragile thing in a stone fortress. A sudden shout from the scullion's window sent his heart into his throat. "Guard!" A rider approaches, fast. Moments later, the kitchen door flew open, and the steward marched in, cloak flapping, eyes blazing. "Cook!" he barked. "Breakfast for the Lord now, or face the consequences." Aldrich ladled the porridge into a pewter tureen and handed it over, voice trembling but steady. "Fresh oats, my lord, boiled as promised." The steward jabbed a gloved finger at the cauldron. "No barley?" Aldrich forced himself to meet the steward's gaze. "Barley store spoiled, sir. I sorted through every sack. Fresh oats will be served instead." The steward's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Substitutions without permission? Lord Beaumont will hear of this defiance." He snatched the tureen and stormed from the kitchen, leaving Aldrich alone with his pounding heart and the crackle of embers. A moment passed, then the stew pot rattled with the arrival of two guards. They seized Aldrich's arms, and he was hauled into the corridor, shackled like a common criminal. Each clank of iron on stone sent pain shooting up his wrists. He tried to steady his breathing, repeating the silent mantra he'd learned in his youth: endure, adapt, survive. But as he was dragged toward the great hall, where destiny waited like a sharpened blade, his stomach turned, not from hunger, but from dread. Behind the heavy oak doors, torches burned in iron sconces, and the great table was set with silver flagons and carved goblets. Aldrich was marched to the dais, where Lord Beaumont sat, draped in ermine and steel. The Lord's cold gaze flicked to the tureen of porridge set before him. Silence stretched taut as a bowstring. "Cook," Lord Beaumont said, voice low and lethal, "why have you dared to insult me with a second-rate meal?" Aldrich swallowed hard, steel chains cutting into his wrists. "My lord, the barley was rotten. I could not in good conscience feed you poison." Beaumont's lips curved in a sneer. "Poison? Or cowardice? Perhaps you find my life less valuable than that of mere soldiers." Aldrich forced himself to stand tall. "My lord, I value your life above my own. I chose oats to spare you illness." The hall fell eerily quiet. Then a single chuckle, low and dangerous, rippled through the room. Beaumont rose, looming above Aldrich. "Very well," he said, voice like iron grinding on stone. "Today you live. But make no mistake. My favor is as thin as this porridge." He waved a hand, and the guards released Aldrich, who crumpled to his knees. "Cook," the Lord continued, "tomorrow you will serve a banquet worthy of my name, or you will serve me your head." As Aldrich prostrated himself, a wave of relief washed through him. He had survived. Yet beneath that relief lay an even fiercer resolve. He would not fail tomorrow. He would scour every storeroom, test every sack, and learn the secrets of preservation that would make him indispensable. For in this world of contaminated grain and capricious lords, survival meant more than endurance. It meant mastering the very elements that threatened to undo you. And so, with shackled wrists and a humbled heart, Aldrich rose from the cold floor of the great hall, determination set in his bones. He would not only cook to live, he would cook to conquer. In the narrow streets of Andover, the Black Death had left more than corpses. It had poisoned the very air of trust between neighbor and neighbor. It started with whispers. The wells have turned foul. Mothers pressed damp cloths to their children's lips, praying that the water would not carry a death sentence. Townsfolk gathered by the central well, peering into its inky depths. Some insisted that mysterious newcomers, wandering beggars and travelers, had tainted the water with dark magic. Others blamed the local apothecary's experiments, accusing him of brewing plague in cauldrons beneath his shop. When the first body floated to the surface, stiff and bloated, the murmurs became shouts. Heresy, witchcraft, poison. As panic spread, the town council convened in the great hall. Cobweb tapestries trembled in the breeze from open windows, and the scent of fear mingled with the sting of spilled ale on the flagstones. Aldermen pointed fingers across the chamber. "The monks have been performing their rites by that spring outside town," one cried. "They say it's holy water, but perhaps they've consecrated disease instead." Another retorted, "Don't be a fool. These so-called heretics who deny the church's power must be behind it. They lurk in the shadows, spreading plague as punishment for our sins." Outside, the common people were no less divided. In the market square, a ragged crowd formed around a dripping fountain. Some knelt in prayer, cupping their hands in the blessed water that dripped from a wooden spigot. Others jeered, splashing the liquid onto the cobblestones, convinced that the church's rituals were a sham. When a group of young men hurled rotten vegetables at the priest's house, the first stones flew in earnest defiance of clerical authority. Shouts of "Down with the monks!" and "Save our water!" echoed off timbered walls. The immediate spark came when Brother Martin, the infirmarian monk, ventured into town to distribute bread and a small vial of rosewater as a supposed disinfectant. His simple act of charity became the flashpoint. Townsmen grabbed the vial, smashed it against the fountain's edge, and hurled insults at him. "Your holy water is poison," they accused. Brother Martin raised his hands in peace, but even his calm voice was swallowed by the roar of rebellion. The townspeople gathered torches and pitchforks, marching behind ragtag banners made from torn tunics. They headed toward the monastery gates, intent on demanding an accounting of the monks' wastewater, their secret rituals, and the source of the stench that many believed spread plague as easily as the flea. Word reached the abbot, who stood in his cell, robes trailing on the stone floor, hands clasped in prayer. He ordered the gates shut, but not locked. He prayed that reason might persuade angry hearts before steel gates forced them apart. At the front of the mob strode Agnes, a widowed weaver whose husband had succumbed to the fever weeks before. Grief and anger had hardened her voice into a blade as sharp as any blacksmith's hammer. "We pay our tithes," she shouted. "We dig your graves, we haul your timber, yet you poison us with your so-called blessings." Her words found ready ears among laborers, bakers, and young men still raw from the loss of siblings and friends. They surged forward, battering at the gates with iron hooks and wooden beams. Inside the cloistered courtyard, the brothers lit lanterns along the covered walk. The abbot, thin and dignified, stepped onto the outer terrace. His voice rang out over the clamor. "Children of God, have pity on one another. The plague is a scourge from the Lord, not a trick of our hands. We bless the water, so that your souls may find grace. Let us share in penance and prayer, together." That plea did little to quell the fury. A mason lobbed a brick that shattered against the chapel window, and shards rained down on the monks below. Panic swept through the courtyard as frightened novices scattered. Only Brother Martin stood his ground, arms crossed, gaze steady. He filled his cupped hands with water from the monastery cistern and splashed it toward the mob, chanting a benediction. The droplets struck the first line of townsfolk like cold fire, stinging their eyes. Some staggered back, clutching their faces. Others shrieked that the water was acid, that the monks had turned baptismal oil into a weapon. In the chaos, a young priest, Father Hugo, appeared at the monk's door, carrying a gilded chalice. "Stop this madness," he cried. "I will pour this water into your barrels. There is not enough here to harm a mouse." The crowd fell silent at the sight of the chalice, its gold glinting in torchlight. They parted as Father Hugo approached the fountain. With trembling hands, he poured a single drop into the barrel closest to the well. All watched in tense disbelief. The silence held for a breath. Then the priest dipped his hand into the water, tasted it, and smiled. "It is as pure as spring rain," he proclaimed. "It has not a trace of poison." The moment of reprieve was fragile. Some in the fringe of the mob huffed derision. "Church trickery," they spat. Yet many, exhausted by grief and guilt, knelt and made the sign of the cross. Agnes dipped her fingers into the fountain, then to her brow. Tears slid down her cheeks as she murmured, "Forgive me, Lord, for doubting thy mercy." That night, the townspeople and monks gathered in uneasy truce. The abbot offered prayers of intercession and set aside a portion of monastery provisions to share with the needy. In return, the town council agreed to help repair the monastery's defunct aqueduct, whose broken stones had sent stagnant water pooling near the latrines. Water that likely harbored the very disease they feared came from holy rites. Both sides recognized that the true enemy was neither heretic nor cleric, but a hidden killer riding on fleas and tainted wells alike. Yet beneath this shaky peace, a second conflict smoldered, one of morality and authority over the bodies and desires of the faithful. The town bathhouse, a fine stone building funded by the Merchant Guild, stood unused on Tuesdays and Fridays, days the church designated as fast and penance. Monks denounced public bathing on these days as baths of sin, urging parishioners to cleanse their souls in the confessional rather than their bodies in water. Bathhouse attendants, many of them former lay brothers expelled from monasteries, defended the baths as essential for health. They argued that open-air swimming in the river, forbidden by clerical decree, was preferred by many townsfolk despite its dangers. Cold water, hidden currents, and occasional sightings of drowned bodies. When Alderman Jeffrey called for a town meeting to enforce bath days of sin, the bathhouse keeper, Isabel, confronted him at the threshold. She wore a loose linen shift and held a bundle of rosemary. "You preach penance," she told him, voice clear over the murmur of assembled citizens. "But for what sins? Drinking too much wine? Gossip? I bathe to wash away lice and disease. Shall I confess a sacrament of cleanliness as sin?" Her outcry drew nods and murmurs. For every pious voice, another spoke of wounded skin, of scabs healed by soap and scrub. That evening, a small crowd demolished the notice declaring the bathhouse closed on fast days. They smashed the wooden shutters and lit aromatic fires of pine needles to sterilize the rooms. The next morning, as the church bells tolled for vespers, Isabel walked from the bathhouse, cheeks flushed and eyes bright. She carried a clay pot of hot water for the infirm, bypassing the priest at the church door. He reached out for her arm, but paused when he saw the grateful nods of townsfolk lining the path, their children clean and well. The bathhouse victory did not go unchallenged. A group of stern-faced monks, led by Brother Gregory, marched to the Guildhall to demand that the baths be reclosed under threat of excommunication. They cited scripture on impurity and the body as a temple best cleansed by fasting and prayer. Guild masters countered with practical logic. A clean workforce was a productive one, and disease spread less in those who bathed regularly. Trade depended on labor, they reminded the abbot, and the abbey thrived when villages did. Faced with this impasse, the abbot intervened. In a rare act of compromise, he decreed that the bathhouse would remain open on all fast days, but would offer a holy soak at dawn, 30 minutes before the regular schedule, during which the infirmarian monk would bless the water with scraped rosemary and a silent prayer. Afterward, the bathhouse would open to all, with priests encouraged to join the faithful in humility. Thus, bathing and blessing became intertwined. Physical clean water and spiritual purification walked hand in hand. When word of this settlement spread, villagers and monks alike breathed a collective sigh of relief. The uprising that had threatened to engulf Andover in bloodshed receded into memory, replaced by a shared ritual that merged the best of both worlds. The bathhouse as a sanctuary for body and soul. In the end, the social conflict born of fear and fanaticism gave way to cooperation, forging a precedent that hygiene and faith need not be enemies, but partners in humanity's unending struggle to survive and to find grace amidst the horrors of the plague. The first murmurs of the Black Death arrived on the coastal wind, carried in the bilge water of Genoese merchant ships that limped into port in late spring. Within days, pale sailors staggered ashore, coughing black flecks of blood, and their gaunt faces spoke of a sickness more terrible than any rumor. The town watch sealed the gates too late. Rats scuttled unchecked through open marketplaces, and fleas jumped from dead cargo into common clothes. When the first corpse collapsed in the market square, its eyes rimmed in red, the cry went up that death himself had walked among the living. Panic spread faster than plague. In hamlets and villages, church bells tolled funeral after funeral, their peals blending into one endless dirge. Fields lay untended as peasants fled to forest hideaways, dragging their families and livestock in hopes of escaping the invisible scourge. Towns emptied, streets littered with abandoned carts and half-eaten loaves, and the once bustling taverns fell silent. Priests, overwhelmed by the tide of dying, abandoned their pulpits. Some stone-shifted mass graves beyond the city walls, while others preached to empty pews that the plague was divine retribution for humanity's sins. As the death toll climbed, often claiming half of a village within a single fortnight, social order collapsed. Feudal lords, fearful for their own lives, retreated behind castle walls, leaving farms untended and serfs without guidance. Where once a landlord's castellan enforced rent and labor, now roamed bands of desperate survivors who raided granaries and slaughtered cattle for food. In some regions, entire villages were quarantined behind wooden palisades. Inside, the healthy watched helplessly as the sick perished, too afraid to break the taboo of contagion. The very fabric of society unraveled. Markets, where peasants once traded grain for cloth, dissolved into barter or outright theft. Guilds, which regulated everything from bread to building, found their ranks decimated. Craftsmen died at their wheels, leaving apprentices to fend for themselves. Parish registers, meticulously kept by rectors, ceased as clergy themselves succumbed. With no one left to record baptisms or marriages, lineage and inheritance became unreliable. An unthinkable crisis in a world governed by bloodlines and land tenure. But amid the horror came radical shifts in thinking about hygiene and medicine. As the plague wreaked havoc, long-held religious explanations, sin as the root of disease, began to chafe against brutal evidence. If every sin was punished, why did the humble peddler flee untouched while the noble lady, robed in silk, perished beside her maid? Doubt flickered in the minds of even the most devout. In some towns, healers who once plied simple tonic waters or poultices found themselves hung as witches or persecuted as incompetent charlatans. In others, they were embraced as saviors, their herbs and distillations regarded as small miracles. Villagers remembered folk remedies passed down through generations. Garlic hung from doorways, vinegar-soaked cloths pressed to the skin, smoke from burning rosemary chasing away miasmas. These home cures suddenly held unexpected prestige. Mothers stirred aromatic stews of onion and sage by the hearth. Shepherds coated their shepherd's crooks with tar and frankincense. Coopers burned juniper boughs to cleanse the air of steam-filled sheds. The line between superstition and proto-science blurred. If church bells and prayers failed to halt death, then perhaps nature's own poisons and perfumes could. This shift spurred the first tentative experiments in public health. Some cities decreed that butchers must dispose of offal outside the walls, not in open gutters. Town councils ordered streets to be swept daily and lime to be scattered over refuse heaps to kill contagion. Watchmen enforced curfews, and watchtowers sprouted along quarantined worst-hit districts. Venetian magistrates created the first lazarettos, floating quarantine hospitals anchored in the lagoon, where arriving ships lay at anchor for 40 days, quaranta giorni before their crews could come ashore. Florence established brigades of plague inspectors who knocked on doors, recorded sickness, and carted the ill to makeshift pest houses beyond the city gates. These measures marked a radical departure from medieval fatalism. The idea that human intervention, rather than divine will alone, could shape outcomes took root. Physicians, many trained in the universities of Padua and Montpellier, began to study the plague as a natural phenomenon. They noted that corpses seethed with fleas, that outbreaks followed trade routes, and that fresh air seemed protective. Encouraged by these observations, they advocated for ventilated homes, for drying out damp cellars, for relocating graveyards downwind of settlements. At the University of Paris, lectures on quarantine and contagion became as vital to medical students as the humors of Galen once were. In households, this change manifested in small but profound ways. Families began hanging strips of cloth around wounds, dabbing them with rosewater or vinegar. They boiled water in cauldrons daily, using the steam to fumigate chambers. They banished pets from bedrooms, fearing the share of fleas they carried. Women embroidered sachets of herbs, bay leaves, wormwood, lavender, and tucked them into linen shifts, believing that fragrant pockets warded off the invisible killer. Even nobles, who once shunned the common harbors of bathhouses, ordered private bath chambers installed in their manors, complete with wood-fired boilers and copper tubs, sometimes perfumed with lemon peel and juniper. Attitudes toward death, too, shifted dramatically. Deathbeds, once the private province of family and priest, became grim stages for last rites amid coughing fits and delirious prayers. But in the aftermath of mass mortality, survivors grew weary of constant mourning. They carved effigies of the dead, held collective memorial services, and wrote epitaphs heralding both human frailty and resilience. Tombstones sprouted memento mori motifs, skulls, hourglasses, wilted flowers, reminding the living that life was fleeting but not meaningless. Dance of Death. Frescoes adorned church walls, illustrating that king and peasant alike must one day meet their maker. In the realm of medicine, long-term transformation took hold. The ancient practice of bloodletting was re-examined. Some argued that opening veins weakened patients further, while others contended it balanced tortured humors. Apothecaries began to distill essential oils, rose, juniper, cinnamon, not only for flavor, but for their antiseptic qualities. The first printed medical treatises on plague management appeared, merging classical theory with observation. Physicians, emboldened by university learning and the crucible of crisis, petitioned for licensing and oversight of practitioners, laying groundwork for professional regulation. Perhaps most revolutionary was the move toward public accountability. Town councils hired plague physicians, often graduates of esteemed schools, on generous retainer, and required them to publish annual reports on sickness, mortality, and successful treatments. These proto-statistical records became invaluable. They revealed that districts with cleaner water and better ventilation suffered fewer deaths, that those who quarantined early slowed the spread, and that simple masks soaked in vinegar might offer some protection. When the next wave of plague arrived decades later, cities were better prepared. Neighborhood watch committees, established lazarettos, and civic charters mandating sanitary inspection all bore the imprint of lessons learned. By the time the Black Death receded, leaving an estimated third of Europe's population dead, the societal landscape had irrevocably changed. Feudal bonds loosened as labor shortages empowered surviving peasants to demand higher wages or leave manors for towns. Towns gained political clout by virtue of their proactive disease defenses, and guilds incorporated health regulations into their charters. The church itself adapted. Mass penance rituals gave way to processions that doubled as public health inspections. Confraternities formed to nurse the sick. Religious orders built hospitals that survived long after the plague ended. In sum, the arrival of the Black Death shattered medieval complacency and sparked a renaissance of hygiene, medical thought, and communal responsibility. What began as a catastrophe beyond human understanding became the grim catalyst for a new era, one in which the body was no longer merely a vessel of sin and suffering, but an object of study, care, and collective stewardship. The legacy of that transformation would resonate through Renaissance medicine and ultimately shape the modern world's fundamental belief that human ingenuity, cooperation, and compassion can confront even the most fearsome scourges. A pale dawn slipped through the narrow lattice of the abbey's ruined cloister, revealing the gray stones slick with morning mist. In the center, a low fountain murmured, its waters once blessed, now tainted by neglect and sorrow. Two figures stood at its edge. The philosopher, Brother Anselm, wrapped in threadbare robes, and Dr. Isabel of Montclair, her leather satchel heavy with poultices and flasks of vinegar. Between them hovered a single question, echoing the doubts of a shattered age. Does it matter to cleanse the body when the soul lies stained? Brother Anselm dipped his hand into the fountain and let the water pool in his palm. He closed his eyes, inhaling the sharp scent of moss and stone. We pour water over our flesh to feel renewed, he murmured. But what good is that when our hearts carry envy, despair, and grief? The soul's contagion travels unseen, yet it wounds more deeply than any plague. He let the droplets trickle back into the basin, forming quiet ripples. I have confessed my sins, begged absolution, and still I feel unworthy. No amount of washing can cleanse regret. Dr. Isabel watched the philosopher's dark eyes, so full of yearning. She knelt and scooped a handful of water, then pressed it against her cheek. Brother, you speak of the soul as if it were a vessel irreparable, she said softly. But the body and spirit are not so easily sundered. When I apply a poultice to a festering wound, I heal more than skin. I restore dignity. A clean wound resists decay. A clean mind resists despair. Physical renewal can be the first step toward spiritual healing. He shook his head. Your remedies ease pain, doctor, but can they touch the guilt of a man who has buried his family in unmarked graves? I feel the weight of every lost soul in Christendom pressed against my chest. If I bathe in this water, will it wash away the sorrow of 300 funerals? Will it absolve me for the prayers I could not pray, the hymns I could not sing through tears? Isabel rose and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. You carry burdens no man should bear alone. Yet consider this. In caring for the body, we acknowledge life's sanctity. Each ritual wash reminds us that we are servants of creation, charged with protecting what God has given. If we neglect our bodies, we betray that trust. She stepped closer to the fountain and addressed the gentle current. Water is a gift. Whether mundane or holy, it flows through every aspect of our being. To refuse its cleansing is to deny the hope that we can be made new. Anselm drew in a slow breath. Hope. I have clung to hope like a dying ember in this plague-blighted world. But I wonder if hope itself is a form of vanity. We scramble to preserve our flesh, sewing linen shifts and boiling water for baths, yet our souls grow brittle with fear. When death passes, he claims both body and spirit without distinction. Isabel reached into her satchel and produced a small linen cloth steeped in rosewater and vinegar. She unfurled it between them, the crisp aroma momentarily clearing the damp air. "Here," she offered. "I have treated this cloth with herbs that ward off infection. Let us wash our hands together, not as a symbol of vanity, but as an act of solidarity. In our shared gesture, we affirm that even in darkness, compassion endures. If the body succumbs, we will at least ensure a merciful end. And if the soul trembles, perhaps this humble ritual will remind us that we are not alone." Anselm hesitated, then accepted the cloth. He passed the water through its folds, rinsing away dust and lichen. As he pressed it to his gaunt hands, his fingers trembled. The cold liquid stung like distant memories. Summer sun on a child's skin, the rough palm of his mother guiding him to the baptismal font. He closed his eyes and let a single tear fall, mingling with the fountain's flow. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "Perhaps you are right, Doctor. A small mercy for the body can kindle mercy for the soul. If I cannot wash away my regrets, at least I can offer gentleness to this flesh and to others." He looked at her with something like gratitude. "Teach me, then, how do we cleanse spirit and skin in tandem?" Isabel smiled, relief softening her stern features. "First, we bathe with intention. Let each drop of water be a prayer for those we've lost and those we still serve. Second, we bind wounds with clean cloth and heal minds with clean words, truth, kindness, forgiveness. Finally, we gather as a community, washing hands before each meal, sharing bread in remembrance that sustenance is both body and spirit." Anselm knelt once more and poured water over Isabel's hands from the fountain. Then she returned the favor. Their robes brushed as they stood side by side, united in an unspoken covenant to honor both flesh and faith. The fountain's ripples broadened into the courtyard stillness, carrying the promise of renewal. Above them, the abbey's shattered arches framed a sky smeared with dawn's pale light. Somewhere, a bell tolled for morning prayer. Brother Anselm and Dr. Isabel walked side by side toward the chapel, their footsteps echoing on wet stones. Each step was a testament to a new understanding, that the line between body and soul is not a divide, but a bridge. And as they passed beneath the ancient arch, they carried with them the simple truth that to cleanse the flesh is to honor the spirit, and that in caring for one, we nurture the other. A hush fell over the abbey scriptorium the moment Brother Aidan scratched the final stroke of ink on the fragile parchment. For months, he had worked in secret, translating an Arabic medical manuscript smuggled from Toledo by a merchant-turned-pilgrim. Now, as candlelight danced across his desk, he held in his hands a compendium of hygiene and healing practices that would shatter centuries of accepted dogma. The tract, penned in elegant Kufic script, described a systematic approach to cleanliness, the use of distilled rosewater for topical wounds, an armamentarium of antiseptic powders made from myrrh and alum, and protocols for separating infirmaries from communal living quarters to contain contagion. It even advised regular bathing schedules, time to circadian rhythms, and techniques for sterilizing surgical instruments in boiling vinegar. All of it flew in the face of prevailing belief that dirt was a divine test, and that physical cleansing risked washing away the protective blessings embedded in sacred grime. Aidan's heart pounded as he closed his translation and glanced around. The other monks, bent over scrolls of scripture or illuminated psalters, not one suspected that within these olive-hued pages lay knowledge powerful enough to redefine the very purpose of the abbot's holy water. He had spent Sundays and nights refining the translation, his Latin clumsy at first, but growing precise under his careful hand. He had consulted the infirmarian, Brother Martin, whose own experiments with rosewater and vinegar had aroused suspicion, and now they were ready for the next step. Under the cover of pre-dawn darkness, Aidan crept down the cloister with Brother Martin at his side. They carried a small chest containing distilled rosewater, alum crystals, and a meticulously copied set of instructions. Their destination was the overlooked bathhouse, a modest stone building originally intended for novice ablutions, but long since fallen into disuse. Months ago, the monks had sealed its doors, deeming warm water an indulgence. Tonight, those doors would open again. Inside, the bathhouse was cold and gloomy. Moss clung to the walls, and a thin film of stagnant water pooled beneath the cracked basin. Martin struck flint to light a lantern. "We have only one chance," he whispered, voice low with excitement. "Tomorrow's infirmary roster arrives at dawn. By then, the monks, and perhaps the abbot, will notice the change." Aidan uncorked the flask of rosewater and poured it into the bath's cistern. He sprinkled in finely ground alum, watching the crystals dissolve in gentle plumes. Then he added a handful of crushed myrrh, the resin's aromatic smoke curling in the lantern light. Martin stoked the furnace beneath the water chamber, and soon the cold pool hissed with heat. A scent of floral spice and antiseptic lifted the gloom, an otherworldly perfume that spoke not of sin, but of healing. They left the doors cracked open and returned to their cells, hearts pounding. At first light, inquisitive novices noticed steam rising from the bathhouse like a beacon. Brother Julian, the monastery's cellarer, poked his head inside. "Who lit the fire?" he muttered, stepping in. The warmth enveloped him, and he coughed at the fragrant vapors. Running a hand along the tiled wall, he found it scrubbed clean of moss and grime. "By Saint Benedict," he breathed. "This place has been swept and scoured." He bent to fill his palms with water and raised them to his face, the cool liquid infused with that heady scent. A ripple of wonder passed through the small group of novices gathered there. Word spread quickly. The bathhouse had reopened, blessed by an unknown benefactor. Some whispered it a miracle. Others grumbled that the infirmarian was up to his old tricks. Yet the monks who bathed emerged with clearer complexions, fewer itches from lice, and even better rest. The septuary rosters showed a startling drop in minor fevers and skin infections among those who bathed regularly. Even the abbot, initially skeptical, sent 2 deacons to investigate. When the abbot arrived at midday, he found Martin demonstrating a simple wound dressing, a poultice of ground rose petals and alum applied to a novice's scraped knee. The boy winced as Martin tightened the bandage, then smiled at the relief washing across his face. Aidan stood quietly at the back, ready to present the translated tract should questions arise. "Brother Martin," the abbot said, voice measured but curious, "who authorized this bathhouse revival?" Martin knelt and presented the manuscript. "Please, Father, open these pages. They explain the wisdom of the East, knowledge that predates our own scribes, and may prove a gift from God to his humble servants." The abbot's eyes narrowed as he accepted the volume. He turned the pages slowly, fingers tracing the Arabic-flavored Latin script. Aidan saw the tension drain from his stern features, replaced by a trace of wonder. The abbot read aloud a passage on water sterilization and then paused, stroking his silvered beard. If these methods can spare even one soul the agony of infection, he murmured, they are worth any risk of heresy. Within days, the monastery routines shifted. Each monk received a personal flask of rosewater for washing hands before meals. The infirmary moved to a separate building, its floors scrubbed with crushed alum overnight. The daily sacred bath returned to the monastic schedule, now embraced not as indulgence, but as discipline. Even the novices were taught the Arabic salutations of respect, Alhamdulillah, praise be to God, whenever they drank or bathed, linking physical regeneration with spiritual gratitude. Outside the abbey walls, neighboring villages heard of the miracle baths and petitioned for their own. Monks traveled as emissaries, teaching distillation techniques and distributing small quantities of myrrh and alum. Over the following seasons, this single discovery rippled through the region. Small hospitals founded by monastic orders incorporated the new protocols. Towns built communal bathhouses beside plague refugees, and local healers blended Arabic and Galenic traditions into a more effective medicine. Brother Aidan, once a humble copyist, found himself called to lecture in the great libraries of Europe, his name whispered with reverence by scholars eager for the East's secrets. Brother Martin's reputation grew as well. He became a provincial inspector of infirmaries, ensuring the new hygiene standards were upheld. Most importantly, the transition felt like a rebirth. Where once the monks had viewed dirt as a divine burden, they now saw cleanliness as stewardship of the body, God's temple. And the bathhouse, once a ruin, stood as a testament to the power of knowledge unbound by borders, a place where the healing waters, both physical and spiritual, flowed freely, baptizing medieval life into a new era of compassion and wisdom. The dawn after the worst wave of plague felt strangely electric in the narrow lanes of Saint-Aubin. Smoke still curled from chimneys, where families burned bedding and contaminated straw. Church bells tolled a cautious thanksgiving rather than dirge. In the marketplace, the newly appointed sanitary wardens, a small band led by Brother Martin, Dr. Isabel, and the former cook Aldrich, took their places beneath the weathered town hall. Word had spread of the abbot's reforms in the monastery next door, and now the city council, desperate to break the cycle of deaths, had authorized the first civic health code in Europe. At Martin's command, teams of laborers swept refuse from the gutters, shoveling rotted vegetation and animal offal into carts bound for burial pits outside the walls. Isabel moved among them, her leather satchel slung over one shoulder, dispensing vinegar-soaked cloths to wipe carts' wheels and offering cordial words of encouragement. Aldrich, sleeves rolled to the elbow, oversaw the reopening of the public bakehouse, now equipped with a separate mill for grain destined for bread rather than animal feed. He demonstrated to local bakers how to inspect sacks of grain for mold and how to store flour in raised bins laced with dried rosemary to deter vermin. These reforms met immediate resistance. In the tannery district, workers jeered the notion that animal hides should be limed and rinsed before tanning. "That's the way our fathers did it, and here we are," one burly tanner growled. Yet when Isabel crouched beside a leech-infested vat, fanning a resin-scented fumigation over it, even he paused to breathe more deeply, shivering in reluctant amazement. In the poorer quarters, mothers hesitated to let their children near the new wash house, fearing the cold stone tubs would bring sickness rather than prevent it. To allay their fears, Martin performed the first public demonstration. He bathed a sunburned boy, scrubbing his scabby arms, then bandaged them with a soothing salve of myrrh and rosewater. The boy laughed, splashing water into the crowd, and mothers exchanged uncertain smiles. Yet the greatest danger came not from superstition, but from entrenched power. The city's wealthiest merchants, whose profits fattened on lax oversight, saw their wares scrutinized for contamination. One prominent spice trader, Maître Bernard, protested that his saffron, harvested from exotic lands, should not be subjected to vulgar inspection. He challenged Aldrich to test his spices for mold. Undeterred, Aldrich stooped over a tray of golden threads, sniffed, rubbed a pinch between thumb and forefinger, and then placed a few strands in a flask of heated vinegar. When the liquid swirled clear, the crowd gasped. When it clouded, Bernard sank red-faced. Under pressure from the council, Bernard's shop was temporarily closed until he could demonstrate proper storage, and the fine on each flake of dirty spice paid most of the warden's wages for a month. As the weeks passed, the city began to breathe easier, literally. The stench of rotting refuse gave way to faint notes of pine wood, vinegar, and charcoal smoke from regular street sweeping. Local schools incorporated basic hygiene lessons. Children learned to wash hands before meals, to avoid stagnant puddles, and to dutifully empty chamber pots into specified pits. Guild charters were amended. Bakers, butchers, brewers, and dyers all agreed to routine inspections, and violators faced fines or public censure. Every Friday, bells rang not for fast or penance, but to remind citizens to inspect their homes for vermin, to change bandages, and to report any signs of fever to the wardens. Despite this momentum, the reformers paid a steep personal price. Isabel suffered a fever herself after caring for a patient and lay bedridden for days, so ill that even Martin feared the scourge had found its way past their precautions. Aldrich's hands cracked from constant scrubbing, and his once proud cook's coat was stained with disinfectant and soot. Yet each time doubt surfaced, the three gathered at the old well in the town square, dipping their hands in icy water and renewing their vow to save as many lives as possible, even if they were reviled as troublemakers. The climax of their struggle came when the city council, pressured by a coalition of nobles and merchants, voted to repeal some of the harsher measures, namely, the ban on open drains and the requirement for muck walls, raised embankments, around latrine pits. The council argued that these rules hindered commerce and forced peasants to travel farther on market days. Protesters chanted, "Trade before taint," in the square, while Bernard's supporters flaunted barrels of dubious cider, daring the reformers to intervene. In response, Martin, Isabel, and Aldrich called for a public assembly. They displayed charts showing a drastic drop in death rates and soothed the crowd with personal testimonies of recovered families. Under the midday sun, they demonstrated how a simple layer of lime could neutralize odors and kill pathogens in waste heaps. They invited skeptics to sample water from wells that had undergone their purification protocol. One by one, the doubters tasted the clear, sweet liquid and were forced to concede. That evening, the council reversed its decision, reinstating the safety ordinances with the added weight of popular support. In a symbolic procession, monks, townsfolk, and even the tanners marched together through the main thoroughfare, sprinkling distilled rosewater from silver flasks onto the cobblestones. As the fragrant mist settled, A hush fell, then applause, hearty and sustained. The city had reclaimed its health through shared sacrifice, cooperation, and courage. Decades passed, and the memory of plague receded into legend. The sanitation code remained, handed down through successive town charters, adapted as new knowledge emerged. Generations learned to value cleanliness not as a luxury, but as an investment in communal well-being. The wash houses expanded, new wells were dug deeper. Hospitals founded by the reformers' successors combined spiritual care with physical healing. Trade flourished when buyers trusted the city's water and food. Artisans embroidered the warden's emblem, a stylized wash basin wreathed in rosemary, as a badge of civic pride. Centuries later, in a bright, modern metropolis built atop the old walls of Saint-Aubin, a young student named Clara stood in a gleaming archaeological exhibit. She studied fragments of medieval pottery, inscribed with sketches of basins and dippers. A placard explained how, in the 14th century, townsfolk had transformed their city through the first sanitation regulations. Clara's fingers traced the faded lines of a rosewater flask recovered from a deep trench. She marveled that something as simple as distilled water and lime could shape the course of history. That afternoon, Clara left the museum and walked to a street food market. She washed her hands in a stainless steel basin with automatic soap dispenser, her habit like everyone else's. Around her, vendors served dishes tested for pathogens. Waste flowed into sealed pipes beneath the pavement. Trees filtered rainwater before it joined the city's reservoir. She took a deep breath of crisp, filtered air and laughed to herself. If only they could see this, she murmured. All because someone dared to scrub away the grime. In that moment, Clara understood the fragile thread that connects us to our past. Every bar of soap, every sanitation engineer, every public health campaign traces its lineage to medieval pioneers who risked scorn, imprisonment, and worse to protect lives. They proved that hygiene is more than habit. It is the foundation of civilization. And as Clara stepped into the sunlight, she felt the weight of those centuries of progress beneath her fingertips, a testament to human resilience and the enduring promise that clean hands and clean hearts can change the world. In every drop of water and every grain of dust lies a choice. Cleanliness was never merely a matter of routine scrubbing or the turn of a basin tap. It was a deliberate decision to assert control over vulnerability. When medieval people bathed, they weren't simply rinsing off sweat and grime. They were affirming their agency in a world ruled by disease and uncertainty. In a time when soap was scarce and water a potential vector for plague, choosing to wash became an act of courage, an assertion that life was worth defending, even in the smallest ritual of personal care. Conversely, filth was normalized because adaptation demanded it. With open sewers beneath cloth-covered streets and shared bathwater turning tepid and rife with parasites, people developed noses that filtered away constant odors and skins that toughened against flea bites. They learned to live with what we now deem intolerable. This was not resignation, but resilience. When circumstances leave no alternatives, survival hinges on the flexibility of body and mind. The medieval norm of living in the dirt reveals our species' remarkable capacity to endure, reshaping perceptions, tolerating hardship, and even finding comfort in communal suffering. Yet today, as we press soft towels to our cheeks and lather fragrant soaps in air-conditioned homes, we inherit more than convenience. We inherit choices made centuries ago by men and women who pondered the worth of a clean hand or a purified wound. Their decisions set in motion the evolution of plumbing, of antiseptics, and of public health. The shining faucets of our modern bathrooms trace their lineage to communal washhouses and secret monastic baths where monks defied dogma in pursuit of hygiene. So here's the question for you. If you were born into a world where water could kill as easily as cleanse, where every breath and every bite carried risk, how would you choose to live? Would you scrape together the embers of hope and carry a small vial of vinegar as a talisman? Would you trade a day's pay for a single bar of homemade soap? Or would you, like so many before you, adapt your senses until the stench became background noise and survival itself a triumph of habit over horror? Consider this as you go about your daily routines, turning the tap, washing your hands, rinsing your face. In each moment of cleanliness, you echo the medieval choice to resist chaos and to proclaim that life, in its fragility, is still worth every drop of water. How would you have survived in their world, and what choices will you make today?